education in 1999. He continued as an arts teacher and facilitator, later moving on to become a lead facilitator, a project manager, business development officer, and administrative director with the unit. So he's currently the funding and business development officer of Arts in Action. We have also Diane Roberts, who I had the pleasure of meeting at a conference recently in Bogota, Colombia. Diane is the artistic director of Urban Inks Productions. She has been a practicing theater artist for over 25 years. Her studies and practical work as director, dramaturge, actor, playwright, and community animator have taken her throughout Canada, the US, the UK, Europe, and the Caribbean. In Canada, Diane has directed for such companies as Theatre Direct, the Company of Sirens, Black Theatre Workshop, Be Current, Cahoots Theatre Projects, Obsidian Theatre, Native Earth Performing Arts, Women in View Festival, the Sudbury Theatre Centre, and the Stratford Festival. As artistic co-director of Nightwood Theatre from 1994 to 1996, she spearheaded the Groundswell Festival of New Works by Women. Over the past few years, Diane's artistic passion has been to articulate, explore, and practice African and diasporic forms of theatre in New World contexts. The research includes ongoing development of her innovative personal legacy methodology for theatre creation. Her current groundbreaking project, the Arrivals Project, a personal legacy workshop series, is making waves across the country, bringing together First Nations and minoritized artists in a meaningful, creative interplay between artistic voice, ceremony, and ancestral recovery. Ms. Danielle Smith is a registered massage therapist with a multidisciplinary practice as a dancer, a capoeirista, and a performance artist. She has performed live theatre at York University and in Mayworks, which is Toronto's Festival of Working People and the Arts, and in multiple short films, some of which have been screened at Mackenzie, the Black Women's International Film and Video Festival in Toronto, and the Inside Out Film Festivals in Los Angeles, Vancouver, Japan, and Toronto. Danielle is currently a co-facilitator and key collaborator with Diane Roberts and Heather Hamont in the Personal Legacy Methodology for Artistic Practice. I'd also like to note that all of these persons today that I just introduced have come as part of the International Advisory Board and have committed themselves in some way to helping us in the way forward in terms of gathering support from arts communities and international communities. And we're also key participants and facilitators in our gathering that we had on Saturday and in our Creative Arts for Social Action workshop that was held yesterday at the University of the West Indies. So I'd like everybody to join for a warm welcome. Thank you so much for being here. So now I'm going to introduce Lee Stewart, who has a keynote lecture for us. Thank you again, Lee. I look forward to hearing this.
Good morning, everybody. I want to tell you a story this morning. Now, this is a story that all of us as Caribbean people know, or we think we do. But in actuality, so few of us actually really know the details of this story. Now, while this story actually begins prior to 1492, 1492 is where I'm going to start, mostly because I only have about 10-15 minutes and I can't go on all day. So I had to start somewhere. In 1492, the Catholic monarchs of Spain had finally managed to reconquer its territories from the Muslim Moors. Now, the Muslim Moors had occupied Spain for the better part of 700 years. So when this reconquest was complete, the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand the Catholic and Isabella the Catholic, turned their attention to the economies and spiritual life of Spain. Isabella had been persuaded to invest in a voyage by a then unknown Genoese sailor whose name was Cristobal Colon, but who's more widely known by the anglicized version of his name, Christopher Columbus. And so she invested in this voyage that he wanted to take westward in order to reach India. Columbus believed that a new and lucrative trade route to India and China could be reached in order to establish new avenues for trade in the precious silks and teas, that European markets hungered for, and he intended to be the first. While the Spanish monarchs did not believe wholeheartedly in this voyage, nonetheless, they had nothing to lose, so they were willing to loan Columbus 3 small ships, the Santa Clara, better known as the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And so on August 3rd, 1492, Columbus began this voyage westward. After almost 2 months of sailing, and despite several threats of a mutiny, on October 12th, the crew sighted land, and so Columbus landed. He landed on a place that was then called Guanahani, but which he took upon himself to remain San Salvador, and which is now called the Bahamas. In his ignorance, Columbus called the men and women who met him Indians, because he believed that he had reached the coast of India. But in fact, the men and women that he met were the Taino Arawak. Now, these Taino Arawak men and women observed Columbus and his malnourished crew, and in keeping with Taino traditions of hospitality, they offered him food, shelter, and materials to repair his ships. Unable to understand a word they said, Columbus nevertheless made several definitive observations about them. Of the people who had just saved Columbus's life and the lives of his crew, Columbus wrote, "They ought to make good and skilled servants, for they repeat very quickly whatever we say to them. I think that they can very easily be made Christians, for they seem to have no religion. And if it pleases our Lord, I will take 6 of them to your highness when I depart, in order that they may learn our language." Additionally, Columbus notes that these people whom he believed had no religion or system of government, despite the fact that he didn't speak a word of their language, were telling him about another group of people who came to take good Taino away, and people Columbus called Los Caniba, because he believed at first that they were slave raiders of the Grand Khan of Asia. Now, the Arawak word he uses here is Caribes, and Columbus uses these words interchangeably in his diary. He uses the word Canibales, Caribes, and Caniba, all thinking they mean the same thing. Now, this is interesting because of these Caniba, Columbus also wrote that the Taino told him, and I'm saying told him because again I have to emphasize, neither he nor anybody else on his crew spoke a word of the Arawakan language. He believed the Taino told him that these were one-eyed, dog-snouted men who ate people. Now, while this might be surprising, not only for the fact that Columbus claimed that the Arawak told him this when he didn't understand them, it was not uncommon in European travel literature at this time to portray strangers that were encountered on a voyage in this way. Europe's earliest works of travel literature, the Odyssey of Homer, makes references to a one-eyed man who eats people, and this motif is featured again and again and again and again in many of the travelogues of famous early European writers. Although Columbus never actually encountered any of these one-eyed, dog-snouted men who ate human flesh, when he returned to Spain with the news that he established a settlement among these peaceful natives, which he called La Navidad, he also took with him a word and an image, that of Los Canibales. 1 year later, Columbus returned, taking with him a young soldier named Ponce de Leon. And the first land they saw on their return, they called Dominica, because this is the Spanish word for Sunday, the day they arrived. On this voyage, however, Columbus could not land. The reason for this was very simple. The Dominican Calinago attacked him the moment his ships tried to put ashore. The young Ponce de Leon later wrote that men and women alike fought with such ferocity that the boats were forced to flee. Ponce, a soldier in Spain's war against the Muslim Moors, also wrote that he had never seen warriors like these. They were struck with several arrows and still they fought. They were stabbed with swords and still they kept fighting. Women fought beside the men, and Ponce recalled that even the women who were pregnant attacked and killed the invaders. In disgust, Columbus and his ships slipped away, believing that they had now found Los Caribes. In reality, the Taino had informed the Calinago of these new people in the waters of their islands and told them that they were not to be trusted because they were greedy and arrogant. When Columbus finally returned to his settlement at La Navidad, it had been destroyed and every man left behind killed by these peaceful Taino. In despair that his plans for settlement were not progressing as smoothly as he had imagined, Columbus once again returned to Spain. Now, perhaps if Columbus had been more respectful of the people he had met, he would have learned that the Taino he assumed had no religion did in fact have a complex system of worship where ancestors were revered and respected. Each tree, rock, river, and natural element had its own spirit, and Los Caribes were in fact a word for spirits, which came to take bad Taino children away, rather than the Kalinago Columbus assumed them to be. He would have learned that the Taino also had an intricate system of government, where local leaders kept the peace at the village level, and caciques made political decisions at the national level. When he wrote that the Taino told them of their wives being stolen by the Kalinago men, he would have done better to listen to the Taino women, whose aggressive nature was considered a feminine trait, to have them tell him that they were not stolen, but had chosen to live with men who understood their aggressive nature and had gone by choice. They would have learned that the Taino practiced agriculture and composed oral histories and poems. They played organized sports, made household furnishing and jewelry, invented barbecuing as a cooking method, and used cassava bread as a travel food so they could journey through the Caribbean by boat. In many ways, Taino culture is reflective of modern Caribbean culture in terms of the proper way to treat guests, the importance of respecting elders and ancestors. Instead, Columbus and these Spanish men chose to believe that there were good Indians and bad Indians. The good Indians were those that helped, and the bad Indians were those that resisted. Eventually, unable to produce the gold-flowing paradise he had described, and unable to colonize the Caribbean as quickly as he first believed because of the mass retaliation by the Taino and the Kalinago, Columbus was returned to Spain under arrest and imprisoned. The very same monarchs who funded his voyage refused to see him, and he languished in a Spanish jail, awaiting his king's pleasure. King Ferdinand had regretted bestowing so much power to Columbus as admiral because they genuinely did not believe he would find anything. So when he came back, and now he had a land that he was speaking of discovering, they were angry that they had given him so much power and regretted it. What this meant was that Columbus's heirs actually had to sue the Spanish crown to be able to get the legacy that was willed to them. And Columbus ended up dying in poverty, with his heirs taking the Spanish crown to court to recoup their inheritance. While Columbus lay forgotten in a Spanish jail, the man who had accused him of mismanaging colonial affairs in the Indies, as the Caribbean was coming to be known, took over as governor. Now, this man was Francisco de Bobadilla. However, he was no more successful at subduing these peaceful Taino or establishing settlements among the Kalinago, who still even refused to allow boats to land within the territories. Unsurprising then, he too was quickly replaced. The Spanish sent another man, Nicolas de Ovando, to see to the colonization process. Now, when Ovando arrived in Hispaniola, he found that the Taino were waging war on the colonists. Realizing that he would not be able to fight the Taino on their own turf successfully, Ovando came up with a plan. He called a truce and invited the Taino leaders of Hispaniola to discuss a treaty. Now, among them was a Taino female cacique, and her name was Anacaona. Her life stands in contrast to the belief that only men were cacique, and with her brethren cacique, she came to treat honorably with Ovando. At the feast, which was said to be in Anacaona's honor at her success in negotiating with the Spanish, de Ovando ordered the meeting house burned. The 8 male caciques were shot, and Anacaona, at the age of 29, was hung for conspiracy against the Spanish crown. So with their political leaders assassinated, the island of Hispaniola now was able to be conquered by the Spanish. The Spanish had learned a new tactic when trying to establish a colony: destroy the leaders first. Ovando's relatives, Cortez and Pizarro, would also use their own versions of this tactic when they were establishing their own colonies among the Aztec and the Inca, but that's another story. Instead, I will tell you about one of the Caribbean's first anti-colonial fighters, Hatwe. A minor Taino leader, Hatwe managed to escape from Hispaniola and sailed to Caobana, which is now called Cuba, with 400 canoes to warn the Taino there following the Spanish execution of the Hispaniola caciques. As the Spanish priest Bartolomé de las Casas wrote, Hatwe showed the Caobana Taino a basket of gold and told them, "Here's the God of the Spanish. For these they fight and kill. For these they persecute us. And that is why we have to throw them in the sea. They tell us, these tyrants, that they adore a God of peace and equality, and yet they usurp our land and make us their slaves. They speak to us of an immortal soul and of their eternal rewards and punishments, and yet they rob our belongings, seduce our women, violate our daughters. Incapable of matching us in valor, these cowards cover themselves with iron that our weapons can't break." Unfortunately, the Taino of Caobana did not believe Hatwe at first, and so he resorted to guerrilla warfare against the Spanish, managing to confine them for the most part in their small forts until he was captured. When he was being led to his execution, Las Casas writes that a priest ran to Hatwe and begged him to accept Christ before his death so that he could go to heaven. But Hatwe refused. Thinking a little, he asked the religious man if Christians went to heaven. The religious man answered yes, and so the chief said without further thought that he did not want to go there, but he wanted to go to hell, so as not to be where they were, and where he would not see such cruel people who committed such atrocities in the name of God. The cruelty of the Spanish and their insane perception of their own right to rule were eventually challenged by Spanish people themselves and Taino alike. And so the Spanish created laws to justify their actions in their inability to simply move in and take what did not belong to them. They need to feel that God was on their side, and so they wrote themselves laws to make themselves believe this. Another of Ovando's relatives, Ponce de Leon, became instrumental in the legalization of indigenous slavery. After he managed successfully to subdue a small rebellion for Nicolas de Ovando, he was granted the right to first settlement on another island the Taino called Boriquen as a reward, an island he promptly renamed Puerto Rico in the hopes that it would live up to its name of a rich port. However, this settlement would not long remain, since while Ponce was off on a journey to the north of the Caribbean to claim a new land he called Florida, in homage to the Spanish Easter festival Pascua Florida, his settlement was destroyed, with his own family narrowly escaping with their lives. Ponce was also to see another stroke of bad luck, since Columbus's son Ferdinand had been successful in his suit against the Spanish crown and replaced Nicolas de Ovando as governor of Hispaniola. Out of spite towards Ovando, Ferdinand Columbus revoked Ponce's claim to Puerto Rico, and Ponce was forced to return to Spain. While there, however, he helped to institute a legal system of indigenous slavery whereby grants of land were accompanied by the forced labor of a number of indigenous captives. This system was called La Encomienda for the enslavement and colonization of the Caribbean. And became the primary means by which indigenous people were enslaved en masse in the newly emerging colonies of the Northern Caribbean. Additionally, a legal justification for the enslavement and colonization of the Caribbean was devised through a document called La Requerimiento, or the Requirement. In part, this document read that God was the creator of the world, and as such, he was its landlord. God had also left the title to the world to St. Peter, who in turn, conveniently, had deeded it to the Spanish crown. Thus, the Americas were technically the rightful property of Spain. And if the indigenous people did not agree with this view, then the requirement noted that I certify to you with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter your country and make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children, and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses command. And we shall take away your goods, and shall do you all the mischief and damage that we can. As to vassals who do not obey and refuse their lord and resist and contradict him, and we protest that the deaths and loss shall receive from this are your fault, and not that of their highnesses, or ours, nor of these cavaliers who come with us. and that we have said this to you and made this requisition, we request the notary here present to give us his testimony in writing, and we ask the rest who are present that they should be witnesses of this requisition. This document was to be read to indigenous populations in Spanish before colonists could claim land for the crown. However, the fact that the document was written and read out in Spanish to either uncomprehending indigenous peoples, empty beaches, villages, or the decks of ships before landing demonstrates, as prompted by the Spanish priest, demonstrates that the Spanish really didn't have any intention of having this make any meaning. They just wanted to read this to the empty air to make themselves feel better about being an invading army. This prompted Bartolomé de las Casas to write that when he heard of this, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry at such arrogance and stupidity on the part of the Spanish. The Northern Caribbean was the main focus for colonization, since many of the leaders had been killed by Ovando, and the Spanish were still too afraid to venture south, the domain of the Kalinago. Some Taino chiefs like Enriquillo had managed to successfully resist the Spanish, forcing them to agree to treaties. But Spanish diseases were now beginning to take their toll on indigenous people. Now, by this point in Caribbean history, which was roughly 60 years after Columbus had first landed in Guanahani, people were beginning to speak out against the ways that indigenous people were dying en masse, and this prompted an academic debate between two men who were felt to be experts in this area. The debate was between Juan Guinness de Sepulveda and Bartolomé de las Casas. Las Casas, from the School of Salamanca and the Humanist movement, worked for years to expose the cruel treatment of the Taino in the encomienda system. This work had led to the laws of the Indies of 1542, which promised to bring the encomienda system to an end. Moved by Las Casas and the others, Ferdinand's son Charles V ordered that further aggressions against the indigenous people of the Caribbean should cease, and called a jury of eminent doctors and theologians to hear both sides and to issue a ruling on the controversy. Las Casas' position found support from the monarchy and the Catholic Church, who wanted to control the power of the encomenderos, while Sepulveda's argument supported the interests of the colonists and the landowners who were benefiting from this system. Though Las Casas tried to bolster his petition by recounting his experiences of the mistreatment of the indigenous people, the debate remained on largely theoretical grounds. Sepulveda took a more secular approach, basing his arguments on the philosophies of Aristotle and the humanist tradition, to say that the indigenous people were naturally predisposed to slavery and could be subjected to bondage or war if necessary. Las Casas objected, arguing Aristotle did not mean this when he spoke of barbarians, and that the Spanish had no precedent in their history or their philosophy for these people whom they had just met. However, in the end, both men believed that they had won the debate, and the deaths of Taino continued. Facing genocide, the Taino began to employ new methods of survival. Some converted to Christianity publicly but practiced Taino spirituality privately, and this gave rise to hybrid traditions. The Taino of Cuba and Hispaniola felt the most impact from the Spanish, but Jamaican and Puerto Rican Taino managed to survive total annihilation despite what colonialist versions of Caribbean history would have us believe. Although people have been writing that there were no more Arawaks since roughly the 17th century, Tainos are still mentioned in Caribbean wills and legal documents like land titles as late as the 19th century. In a 1998 genetic study conducted in Puerto Rico, it was found that of the 56 volunteers who participated in the study, 70%, or 39 people out of 56, showed Taino DNA. As educator Antonio de Moya of the Dominican Republic puts it in his 1993 article, the genocide is the big lie of our history. The Dominican Tainos continue to live 500 years after European contact. Taino populations have also re-emerged in Cuba and Puerto Rico, and Taino culture is being revived and preserved as a post-colonial response to historical erasure. Now, you might be wondering all of this, well, what about the Kalinago, or the Caribs, as they were later mistakenly renamed? For the most part, the Kalinago experienced a very different history than their Taino neighbors. The Spanish turned their attention northward from the Greater Antilles and moved toward Florida, Mexico, and down into South America. the Lesser Antilles were very much left alone, potentially out of fear. While some may feel that this was out of fear that the Kalinago were believed to be cannibals, I would argue instead that it had more to do with the superior Kalinago knowledge of the terrain they lived in, their culture of militancy, which was instilled as young as adolescents, and their refusal to be captured at all costs, prompting one French writer to observe that Kalinago will wither and die if captured because they simply cannot tolerate their loss of freedom. Now, I want to take this opportunity to state publicly that to date there has never been any archaeological or anthropological evidence that the Kalinago ate human flesh. It is interesting that although the Spanish cast off their belief in one-eyed dog-snouted people, the eaters of flesh belief remained. This may be due in part to a law passed by Queen Isabella that stated that it was illegal to enslave indigenous people in the Caribbean, but it was not illegal to enslave cannibals. What is worth mentioning is that although several early European colonists claim to have seen examples of cannibalism, when you do a comparative analysis of these writings, it becomes immediately clear that certain stock phrases are repeated, and this leads me as an indigenous scholar to theorize that they were all copying the words from the same account. They all make mentions of strings of arms and legs, comparable to European butcher shops, as well as prisoners begging to be spared and rescued by European colonizers from being eaten. In fact, one of the most famous of these accounts can be seen in Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. By that time, it appears that this stereotype was so interwoven into the European imagination that Defoe uses almost exactly the same strings of words that were being used over and over and over by different travel writers. It is these writers that are being referenced when people try to make the argument that Kalinago were cannibals. And I feel that work needs to be done to better investigate this theory that this belief is false, given that irrespective of the writer, the time period, or community location, they all seem to be seeing exactly the same scene. Nonetheless, the Kalinago managed to repel the Spanish and only began to feel the encroachment their Taino neighbors felt with the arrival of the British and the French. Eager to establish colonies in the Caribbean in order to gain some of the wealth the Spanish seemed to be getting, France and England began organizing their own colonies. The Kalinago made treaties with the British against the French and the French against the British. They were notorious for sailing in and burning down colonial settlements before sailing away again. The Kalinago were successfully resisting colonial settlements some 200 years after Columbus first encountered them there in 1493. The Kalinago were still fighting off the British and French some 300 years after the beginning of European colonialism, and the descendants of Kalinago people continue to resist colonial encroachment on their territories to this day. Given this penchant for liberty, it can't be surprising that they would form bonds with Africans who valued their liberty and formed communities like the Garifuna community here in St. Vincent and the Garifuna of Dominica. For a Kalinago, and this is equally true, I would say, of their Garifuna descendants, liberty is more than a right, it's a necessity. Although the Europeans respected the Kalinago, this was not as equals. This was because the Kalinago simply wouldn't have it any other way. Perhaps if Europeans had not been so fast to try to destroy Kalinago communities, they would have learned that the Kalinago were master sailors and navigators, that they believed and treasured their freedom like the air that they breathed. As a side note, if you're a Caribbean person who loves pepper sauce, you might want to thank a Kalinago for that, because they're the ones who invented it. Some scholars believe that it's them that invented the pepper sauce and gave it to all the rest of us. So since all of us as Caribbean people love our pepper, hug up a Kalinago or a Garifuna the next time you see one, thank them for that. So by now you might be wondering, what's the point of this history lesson so early in the day? The reason for this is every Caribbean child is taught that we as Indigenous people do not exist, and this has to stop. Every generation is taught about us using the words and beliefs of other people. Our stories are being lost, and our heroes are being forgotten. Our cultures are being misrepresented, and our people are not being given their rightful place as the Caribbean's first freedom fighters. the history of other atrocities committed under European colonialism, such as the history of slavery and indentureship, is given the space it needs to be studied and articulated, and the time has come for Indigenous history to be put back into Caribbean textbooks so that school children do not believe that we are all dead. We live, we thrive, we survived, and we are still here. However, we're facing a crisis of immense proportions. With every elder who passes away without having their memories recorded, we lose a piece of ourselves that we can't get back. Our new tech-savvy generation